The hall was glittering. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across the polished marble floors, illuminating rows of guests dressed in silks and satin, all celebrating a union that had been long anticipated. Yet, in the corner, she sat alone. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, clutching a small clutch bag she barely remembered bringing. The chatter around her, laughter, clinking glasses, whispered compliments, seemed to exist in another universe. No one saw her, at least no one that mattered. The bride, radiant and beaming, was surrounded by admirers. The groom's family had taken their seats, their smiles polite but distracted, and she was just a shadow in a world of celebration. She didn't know it yet, but this evening would pivot everything she thought she knew about power, presence, and personal agency. A soft voice interrupted the swirl of music and polite conversation. "Act like you're mine tonight," it whispered. She looked up. At first she thought it was a joke, a stranger testing her composure. But the man standing before her, impeccably dressed, exuding quiet authority, wasn't looking for amusement. His gaze held recognition, calculation, and an unusual kindness. Her heart skipped a beat, not from attraction, not yet, from the realization that someone somewhere had seen her, truly seen her, when no one else had bothered. Here's what that moment teaches us. In life, the moments that feel small, private, or unnoticed can be the very catalysts for transformation. A single glance, a quiet command, a subtle act, these can shift the trajectory of an entire life. And for her, that moment was about to. But before the transformation could begin, there had to be tension. The world she knew, a world of polite smiles and invisible barriers, had to collide with a new reality. The man wasn't just offering attention, he was offering leverage, and leverage, as we'll see, demands action. She didn't know it yet, but the choice she made in the next 10 minutes would determine whether she remained a passive observer in life, or stepped into a game where the rules were written for the bold. And as she rose slowly, her spine straight, her shoulders squared, one thought flickered in her mind: what if I dared to play? The camera doesn't linger on her hesitation, it moves forward with her, into a story of strategy, courage, and moral reckoning. Mini cliffhanger. The man smiles faintly as if he already knows the answer, but does she? She had never imagined herself sitting alone at a wedding, not like this. Growing up, she had been taught that visibility mattered, but not too much. Confidence was applauded in others, yet subtly questioned in her. Intelligence was celebrated in theory, but ambition was often met with sideways glances and quiet warnings. Her journey had been a delicate dance between expectation and self-preservation. Family pressures, societal biases, and subtle exclusion had shaped her worldview. In school, she was often the only black girl in advanced classes. Teachers praised her in front of others, but seldom sought her opinion when decisions were made. In the corporate world, promotions bypassed her, not due to lack of skill, but because her brilliance made others uncomfortable. She learned early. The world applauds potential quietly but seldom rewards it loudly. And yet, she thrived in the shadows. Not everyone noticed her wins, but she did. She studied patterns, observed power, and quietly mastered skills others overlooked. Her network wasn't vast, but it was strategic. She knew how to move silently, calculate, and adapt. Her resilience had been forged not in celebration, but in survival. That evening, at this wedding, all of that history condensed into a single quiet moment. Sitting alone wasn't just about isolation, it was the echo of years of being underestimated. Every sideways glance, every polite dismissal, every invisible ceiling had led her here. Here's what that moment teaches us. The root of many struggles isn't always external, it's the invisible systems that shape choices, dictate behavior, and condition self-perception. Recognizing the structure of these systems is the first step toward turning passive endurance into active strategy. She didn't know it yet, but the quiet power she had cultivated over years, her analytical mind, her emotional resilience, her ability to read people, was about to collide with opportunity. The stage was set, the room full of people who had ignored her, and one man who saw her potential immediately. A single action could flip the entire outcome. One choice, one subtle movement, could redefine how she engaged with a world that had long underestimated her, and for her, that choice would arrive faster than she expected. Mini cliffhanger. As she adjusted her posture and exhaled, a memory flickered, a promise she had made to herself years ago: never let invisibility define me. The whisper of the stranger, almost imperceptible, reminded her that the moment of truth had arrived. The whisper lingered in her mind like a pulse. Act like you're mine tonight, not a command of possession, exactly, but a challenge, a test, a question of identity and courage. She could stay in the corner, invisible, blending with the decor as she always had. It would be safe. No one would notice if she retreated into the shadows, but safety had never served her ambitions, her vision, or her dignity. Every time she had chosen invisibility, she had paid a hidden cost. Lost opportunities, erased contributions, and silent frustration. Yet the alternative, stepping forward, embracing a role that society had never prepared her for, carried risk. Misreading the man's intentions could humiliate her. Acting boldly could expose her to gossip, judgment, or worse. The stakes were more than social, they were moral and psychological. How far could she bend herself to survive, and at what cost to her integrity? Here's what that moment teaches us. Life rarely presents choices without tension. True growth emerges when we face moral forks, the path of least resistance, or the road of courage, strategy, and calculated risk. The difference is rarely obvious, but the consequences are always profound. She didn't know it yet, but this wasn't about seduction, control, or ego. It was about agency, about recognizing that power often masquerades as opportunity, and opportunity rarely knocks twice. Her mind raced through scenarios. Step forward and risk misunderstanding, misalignment, or ridicule. Stay seated and preserve comfort, but reinforce a pattern of invisibility. Find a subtle, clever path that asserts presence without compromise. The tension in that moment wasn't just external, it was internal. Her values, her strategy, her desire to rise above invisibility, all collided in a quiet battlefield of decision-making. One action, one calculated move, could transform her from a spectator to a player. A single action flipped the entire outcome, and she realized that the power of choice, when combined with insight and courage, was more valuable than the applause she had never received. Mini cliffhanger, she exhaled, her decision forming, small, deliberate, almost imperceptible, yet it carried the weight of everything she had endured. The man's eyes held a flicker of expectation, and in that brief exchange, she understood the game had begun. She didn't make a scene, she didn't announce herself. Instead, she acted quietly, deliberately, like a strategist testing the board before making a move. As the man led her to the dance floor, she noticed details everyone else missed. The subtle shifts in body language, the whispered conversations between guests, the unspoken hierarchy of attention. She catalogued every glance, every posture, every reaction, not out of vanity but out of understanding. She had studied people like this for years, anticipating moves, reading intentions, and calculating leverage. Here's what that moment teaches us. True power isn't always loud. Often it's silent, analytical, and invisible, until it manifests at precisely the right time. The world rewards those who act, yes, but it privileges those who observe first, act second. As the evening unfolded, her hidden intelligence began to manifest in small, seemingly inconsequential ways. A subtle gesture that redirected a conversation in her favor. A carefully timed laugh that revealed insight while keeping the room relaxed. A poised posture that suggested confidence without arrogance. No one noticed, not yet, but she was shifting the balance quietly, imperceptibly. She was no longer just a guest at a wedding. She was a participant in a strategic theater of social dynamics. She didn't know it yet, but these small, deliberate actions were the first tremors of a larger transformation. The man who had whispered in her ear wasn't just a stranger, he was an observer of potential, someone who recognized that the true game was never in the ballroom, but in the subtle mastery of presence, perception, and timing. A single insight began to crystallize. While others relied on force, charm, or convention, she had an edge, an intelligence refined by years of navigating systems that were not built for her, and in that edge lay opportunity. Mini cliffhanger. As the music swelled and the room's attention shifted elsewhere, she caught the man's eye again. This time, his gaze was different, expectant, as if he knew she had begun to see what few ever realized. The power had always been hers. Just as she began to feel the first taste of control, the world reminded her why invisibility had been her default. A comment, seemingly casual, sliced through the air. "I didn't think she'd even show up," whispered a voice from across the room. Laughter followed, sharp and clipped, heads turned, eyes narrowed. She felt the familiar sting of judgment, the old pattern replaying in real time. She faltered, her posture tightened. The small confidence she had built in the quiet moments of observation wavered under the weight of public scrutiny. All those years of playing invisible, of carefully calculating each move, seemed suddenly fragile. Here's what that moment teaches us. Systems of bias and subtle sabotage are designed to test the limits of our resilience. Often the world will conspire to expose your vulnerabilities at the moment you begin to rise, but the difference between failure and transformation lies in how you respond. She didn't know it yet, but this public breakdown was a necessary inflection point. It would force her to confront fear, humiliation, and doubt, the very forces that had kept her confined to the shadows. The man who had whispered to her earlier stepped closer, not to rescue, but to observe. His presence reminded her of something critical. True strategy is not about avoiding breakdowns, it's about navigating them. Every slip, every misstep, every public rebuke can become a pivot point if you retain clarity, focus, and self-awareness. A single humiliation can define you, or it can define the turning point that redefines everything. In that moment, as whispers and judgment swirled around her, she clenched her fists under the table, not in defeat, but in quiet resolve. Her inner voice spoke louder than the mocking crowd. I will not be invisible. I will not be diminished. This is my moment to act, not react. Mini cliffhanger. The lights glinted off the crystal chandeliers above, the crowd continued their murmurs, and she realized she had been pushed to the edge, and the next step would decide whether she fell or soared. She stepped away from the table, needing a moment of solitude. The murmur of the crowd, the clinking glasses, the laughter that had once felt alien, it all faded into the background. Alone in a quiet hallway, she took a deep breath. The humiliation she had just endured felt heavy, but beneath it stirred something sharper: clarity. Here's what that moment teaches us. Often the breakthrough comes, not when the world applauds, but when you grant yourself permission to see clearly. Pressure reveals cracks, but also illuminates pathways previously hidden. She remembered the words of a mentor from years past. Resilience is not about enduring, it's about redirecting your energy. Strategy turns friction into momentum. She didn't know it yet, but the whisper from the stranger at the wedding, combined with years of careful observation and unacknowledged brilliance, had prepared her for this exact moment. She could no longer act reactively. She needed a plan that leveraged her intelligence, patience, and awareness. In that quiet hallway, she sketched her strategy mentally. Assess and observe, understand the dynamics at play, identify allies, and uncover weaknesses in the social hierarchy. Leverage perception, use presence, posture, and subtle cues to command attention without aggression. Execute quiet wins, small calculated actions that would accumulate influence and respect. Shift power publicly, transform private preparation into a visible, undeniable reversal. A single action could flip the entire outcome, but only if executed with precision, patience, and moral clarity. The embarrassment of the ballroom wasn't the end, it was the spark that ignited her strategy. She didn't rush, she let the insight sink in. She let her mind visualize each step, anticipate reactions, and plan contingencies. For the first time that evening, she felt a rare alignment between her past, her present, and the potential future. The stranger's eyes appeared at the end of the hall, quiet, observant, expectant, and in that silent exchange she realized something crucial. This wasn't about him, or them, or the world's judgment. This was about her mastery over the moment. Mini cliffhanger. With a deep exhale, she turned back toward the ballroom. The game had shifted, and this time, she was no longer playing defensively, she was preparing to ascend. She returned to the ballroom, but she didn't re-enter the room as a guest. She entered it as a strategist, moving deliberately, observing carefully, and letting each action accumulate impact. The first move was subtle, a nod here, a polite interjection there, a quiet laugh timed to align with conversation dynamics. Nothing overt, but each gesture shifted attention toward her. She had learned long ago that influence often grows invisibly, like roots beneath the soil, until one day the tree has risen. Here's what that moment teaches us. True transformation doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Often it is quiet, patient, and cumulative. Silent wins accumulate into undeniable power. She scanned the room, noting patterns of alliances, unspoken tensions, and gaps in the social hierarchy. A single glance, a strategically timed compliment, a question directed to the right person. Each action was a calculated move, a chess piece sliding into place. She didn't know it yet, but the guests who had underestimated her were beginning to sense something had shifted. Her confidence radiated without ostentation. She was no longer reactive. She was proactive. Her influence was growing silently, almost imperceptibly, but the effects would become obvious soon enough. By the end of the evening, she had repositioned herself socially without drawing overt attention. Key players in the room now sought her input, noticed her presence, and subtly deferred to her insight. She had turned invisibility into a stealth advantage. A single action had flipped the entire outcome, not explosively, but methodically. Quiet wins had compounded. The groundwork for a public reversal was now firmly laid. Mini cliffhanger. As the man who had whispered to her earlier caught her gaze, a small knowing smile crossed his lips. He knew the ascent had begun. And somewhere in the room, those who had dismissed her were about to realize that the game had changed, forever. The ballroom was alive with chatter, laughter, and the soft notes of the string quartet. Everyone believed the night followed the familiar script. The bride and groom were the center, and she, the quiet observer, would fade into the background once again. But scripts are meant to be rewritten. She stepped forward subtly, yet deliberately. This time she wasn't blending in. She engaged in conversation, spoke with authority, and positioned herself as someone whose presence mattered. People who had once dismissed her now leaned in, listened intently, and even sought her opinion. A few awkward glances revealed their surprise. the recognition that the quiet, invisible woman was suddenly commanding influence. Here's what that moment teaches us. A silent climb reaches its apex when preparation meets opportunity. Strategic patience allows subtle actions to compound into undeniable authority, and the most powerful reversals are often moral as well as social. She wasn't seeking revenge, she was asserting rightful presence. The man who had whispered earlier approached again. This time there was no whisper, only acknowledgement. His presence reinforced her assent, a quiet endorsement of the power she had claimed for herself. Together they moved through the crowd with effortless synchronicity, not dominance, but mastery. One by one those who had humiliated or ignored her were exposed, not through confrontation, but through her composed presence. Her intellect, timing, and quiet confidence rendered past slights irrelevant. She had transformed humiliation into leverage, invisibility into influence, and a public breakdown into a spectacle of understated mastery. She didn't just win, she transformed the room's dynamics, shifting the hierarchy with quiet precision, and in doing so she revealed an essential truth. Authority is not given, it is claimed, through intelligence, courage, and moral clarity. Mini cliffhanger. As the night reached its apex, and eyes followed her every move, she realized something profound. The world could no longer define her limits, she had redefined them herself. The music faded, leaving only the hum of conversation and the soft clinking of glasses. The guests once caught in their assumptions and judgments, now lingered in quiet acknowledgement. She had changed the dynamic, not by spectacle, but through mastery of presence, strategy, and insight. Here's what that moment teaches us. Every transformation carries consequences. Power and influence don't exist in a vacuum. They ripple outward, affecting not only the individual but the environment they inhabit. Redemption isn't only for the one who rises, it's also for those who witness the rise, who are invited to reassess their assumptions, and perhaps their own behaviors. Those who had dismissed or humiliated her face subtle reckonings. A whispered correction here, an unanticipated deference there, not humiliation for humiliation's sake, but the moral weight of recognition. They had underestimated someone who had never relied on superficial validation, someone who had quietly accumulated wisdom, patience, and insight. The man who had whispered the initial challenge watched from across the room, not as a savior, but as an observer of potential fulfilled. She understood now the gift was never his to give. It had always been hers to claim. And she claimed it, fully, gracefully, and unapologetically. Her presence now radiated an authenticity that drew respect rather than demand. The lessons of invisibility, the years of careful observation, the quiet triumphs, and even the public breakdown, all converged into a moment of undeniable transformation. She didn't just emerge victorious, she inspired change in others. Guests whispered, reflected, and reconsidered their assumptions about visibility, power, and potential. For some it was a wake-up call, for others a lesson in humility. Mini cliffhangerous insight. As she left the ballroom later that night, she carried more than a sense of personal triumph. She carried the quiet assurance that mastery, courage, and moral clarity could ripple far beyond the self. The story was no longer only hers. It had become a blueprint for those willing to observe, learn, and act strategically in the world. The ballroom lights dimmed, chairs were pushed back, conversations drifted, and the night drew to a close, yet the impact of her presence lingered, like a quiet echo in a room that had once dismissed her. Here's what that moment teaches us. Legacy is not built in applause or recognition, it's built in the consistent choices we make when the world underestimates us, when systems are stacked against us, and when the easy path is to remain invisible. True power is the alignment of intelligence, courage, and moral clarity. She didn't just navigate the room, she reshaped it, not through force, but through strategy, not through ego, but through disciplined observation, calculated action, and unwavering self-respect. The lessons she embodied that night extend beyond a single event. They are a blueprint for anyone seeking to claim their rightful space in a world that may not yet recognize their worth. She didn't know it at the time, but the ripple of her actions would influence more than her immediate environment. The subtle shifts in perception, the quiet realignment of power, and the demonstration of integrity and resilience would inspire others, friends, colleagues, and even strangers, to recognize their own potential. And here's the key takeaway for you. Watching this story unfold, your agency is yours to claim. Every overlooked glance, every whispered doubt, every system that tries to constrain you, these are not walls, but indicators of where your strategy, patience, and intelligence can shine brightest. A single action can flip the entire outcome. Strategic patience, silent observation, and moral courage can transform public perception, dismantle barriers, and leave lasting impact. She stepped forward, she claimed her space, and in doing so, she left a legacy that transcended the evening. So ask yourself, where in your life are you sitting quietly, underestimated, overlooked? Where could a small deliberate action today begin to reshape your world? Like, comment, and subscribe if this story resonated with your values. Share your reflections below, because the journey from invisibility to influence starts with awareness, and every step you take has the potential to inspire change. Final insight: mastery is not given, it is claimed. And when you act with clarity, courage, and strategic intelligence, the world has no choice but to notice.